In a bustling city in the southern United States, life moved at its usual pace. The streets were alive with people going about their daily routines, some heading to work, others grabbing coffee or chatting with friends. But beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary town, tensions had been simmering for years. For decades, the relationship between law enforcement and minority communities had been strained. Stories of unfair treatment, racial profiling, and excessive force weren't uncommon here. And while many tried to ignore it, hoping things would get better on their own, others felt the weight of injustice every single day. One person who knew this reality all too well was a man we'll call the Judge. He wasn't just any resident. He was one of the few black judges serving in the local circuit court. Known for his fairness and dedication to justice, the Judge commanded respect wherever he went. People admired him not only because of his position, but also because of how he carried himself, with dignity and grace. Despite his high-profile job, he lived a simple life, often walking through his neighborhood instead of driving. To him, staying connected to his roots mattered more than anything else. On this particular evening, the Judge decided to take a leisurely stroll after picking up a cup of coffee from his favorite cafe. Dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, he blended in perfectly with everyone else around him. No one passing by could tell that this unassuming man held so much power within the legal system. Even the Judge himself seemed relaxed, scrolling through his phone as he waited near a street corner for his ride to arrive. Little did he know, trouble was brewing nearby. A police officer named Ryan Carter was patrolling the area that night. Carter wasn't exactly popular among the residents. Over the years, he'd earned a reputation for being quick-tempered and dismissive, especially when dealing with people of color. Complaints about his behavior piled up, but nothing ever stuck. Whether it was due to lack of evidence or connections higher up, Carter always managed to skate by without consequences. As fate would have it, Carter's path crossed with the Judge's that evening. Spotting the hooded figure standing near the corner, Carter immediately grew suspicious. In his mind, anyone lingering in public spaces late at night must be up to no good. Without hesitation, he pulled over and stepped out of his patrol car, approaching the Judge with an air of authority. "Hey, you! Put your hands where I can see them," Carter barked, his voice loud enough to startle those nearby. The sudden command caught the Judge off guard. Confused, he looked up from his phone and saw the officer glaring at him. Calmly, he lowered his phone and raised his hands slightly, trying to defuse the situation. "Officer, is there a problem?" he asked. His tone polite yet firm, but Carter wasn't interested in explanations. His eyes narrowed as he sized up the Judge, zeroing in on his casual attire. To him, the hoodie screamed, criminal, reinforcing the stereotype he'd long held in his mind. Ignoring the Judge's question, Carter pressed further. "Why are you hanging around here? Do you live in this neighborhood?" "Yes, I do," the Judge replied evenly. "I'm waiting for my ride. Is there something specific you need from me?" Instead of easing up, Carter's frustration boiled over. He hated being questioned, especially by someone he assumed was beneath him. "Don't play smart with me," he snapped, taking a step closer. "You think you're above the rules?" The exchange quickly escalated. When the Judge calmly pointed out that he hadn't done anything wrong and deserved respect, Carter lost control. In a fit of rage, he slapped the Judge across the face, a shocking act of violence that left both men stunned. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The Judge staggered back, clutching his cheek, disbelief etched across his face. Meanwhile, Carter froze, realizing what he'd just done. Neither of them noticed the crowd gathering around them, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Someone shouted, "That's a Judge." Another voice chimed in, "Did you see what he just did?" Within seconds, phones were out, capturing the aftermath of the incident. Videos began circulating online almost instantly, sparking outrage far beyond the confines of the neighborhood. Little did Carter know, his reckless actions had set off a chain reaction that would change everything. For him, for the Judge, and for the entire community. What happened next shocked everyone involved. leaving no one untouched by the ripple effects of that fateful night. The moment the slap landed, a heavy silence fell over the scene. The judge stood frozen, his hand instinctively reaching up to touch his stinging cheek. For a split second, he couldn't believe what had just happened. Here he was, a respected figure in the community, someone who spent his days ensuring justice was served. And now he was standing on a street corner, assaulted by the very person meant to protect and serve. Officer Carter, on the other hand, seemed to realize too late that he might have crossed a line. His face flushed red, not just from anger but also from the sinking feeling that he'd made a colossal mistake. He tried to regain control of the situation, barking orders at the judge as if raising his voice could somehow erase what he'd done. "You don't talk back to me," he shouted, pointing a finger inches away from the judge's face. But his words only fueled the growing tension. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Some people gasped when they saw what happened. Others began recording the incident on their phones. A woman nearby whispered to her friend, "That's him, isn't it? That's the judge we see on TV sometimes." Her friend nodded wide-eyed as she watched the drama unfold. Word spread quickly through the group. This wasn't just any random citizen being harassed. It was one of their own, a man known for fairness and integrity. For the judge, the realization that he was surrounded by neighbors and strangers alike brought a mix of emotions. On one hand, he felt humiliated. How dare this officer treat him like a criminal? On the other hand, he knew that staying calm was crucial. If there was one thing years of presiding over courtrooms had taught him, it was the importance of keeping your composure under pressure. Taking a deep breath, he lowered his hand and looked directly at Officer Carter. His voice was steady but firm. "Do you even know who I am?" he asked. Carter hesitated. Up until now, he hadn't given much thought to the man's identity beyond his appearance. To him, the judge had simply been another suspect, a hoodie-wearing individual loitering in a neighborhood where such behavior supposedly warranted suspicion. But something about the way the judge carried himself, the quiet authority in his tone, made Carter pause. Still, pride got the better of him. Rather than backing down, he doubled down, snapping back, "It doesn't matter who you are. You're breaking the law." Breaking the law? The absurdity of the accusation struck the judge immediately. He hadn't so much as jaywalked, let alone committed any crime. Yet here he was, being accused and attacked without cause. Determined to set the record straight, he reached into his pocket slowly, careful not to alarm Carter further, and pulled out his identification card. Holding it up for the officer to see, he said calmly, "Look closely. Does this change anything?" The ID card bore his name, photo, and title, Circuit Court Judge. For a brief moment, Carter's bravado faltered. His eyes widened as he processed the information, panic creeping into his expression. This wasn't some ordinary civilian he could bully into submission. This was someone with real power, someone who could make life very difficult for him. But instead of apologizing or de-escalating, Carter's fear turned into defensiveness. He grabbed his radio and called for backup, muttering excuses about how the judge matched the description of a robbery suspect. As more officers arrived on the scene, the crowd grew larger and angrier. Protest chants began to echo through the streets, "No justice, no peace, and we deserve respect." People held up their phones, capturing every detail of the confrontation. Some shouted questions at the officers, demanding answers about why an innocent man had been assaulted. Others stood silently, their arms crossed, glaring at the police presence with unmistakable disdain. Meanwhile, the judge remained composed, refusing to let the situation spiral out of control. When Carter tried to place handcuffs on him, claiming he needed to take him in for questioning, the judge firmly refused. "I'm not resisting arrest," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "But you need to understand that this is unlawful. I will cooperate, but only after you explain exactly what crime you believe I've committed." His words resonated with the crowd. Many nodded in agreement, emboldened by his courage. Even some of the arriving officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with how things were unfolding. It was becoming painfully obvious that Carter had acted impulsively and recklessly. But the damage was already done. The viral videos captured everything: the slap, the shouting, the growing unrest among bystanders. Within minutes, social media platforms lit up with posts about the incident. Hashtags like "Justice for the judge" began trending locally, then nationally. Comment sections filled with outrage, calls for accountability, and stories of similar experiences shared by others who had faced mistreatment at the hands of law enforcement. Back at the scene, tensions continued to escalate. Officers formed a perimeter around Carter and the judge, attempting to shield them from the increasingly agitated crowd. But the barrier only seemed to provoke more anger. Someone shouted, "Why are you protecting him? He hit a judge." Another voice chimed in, "What would have happened if he wasn't a judge? Would anyone care?" The question hung heavy in the air, forcing everyone present to confront an uncomfortable truth. If the judge hadn't been wearing that robe metaphorically, if he hadn't been someone with influence and recognition, would this moment have mattered at all? Would the cameras have rolled? Or would the incident have faded into obscurity, dismissed as yet another example of systemic injustice? As the night wore on, it became clear that this wasn't just about one bad decision made by one officer. It was about something much bigger, a reflection of the deep-seated mistrust between
law enforcement and marginalized communities.
And while the judge may have been the victim tonight, he understood that countless others didn't have the same platform to fight back. With each passing minute, the stakes grew higher. What started as a routine patrol had spiraled into a national conversation about race, power, and accountability. For Officer Carter, the consequences of his actions were only beginning to sink in. For the judge, the road ahead promised to be long and challenging, but also full of opportunities to demand meaningful change. And for the rest of the world watching online, tuning into live streams and reading updates, it was impossible to look away. By the time the sun began to rise, the entire city and much of the country was talking about what had happened the night before. Social media feeds were flooded with videos and screenshots of the incident, each one adding fuel to the fire. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, replaying the footage of the slap over and over again while commentators debated its implications. It was impossible to ignore. A judge, a symbol of fairness and authority, had been assaulted by an officer sworn to uphold the law. For many people, the video wasn't just shocking, it was infuriating. It didn't matter if you lived in the same neighborhood or miles away. The sight of someone being treated so unfairly struck a nerve. People saw themselves in the judge's shoes. They imagined how they'd feel if they were standing on that street corner minding their own business only to be attacked for no reason. Conversations erupted everywhere, in living rooms, coffee shops, workplaces, and online forums, as people grappled with what they'd witnessed. The outrage wasn't limited to ordinary citizens either. Elected officials weighed in, calling for accountability and transparency. Local leaders demanded answers from the police department, questioning why such behavior was allowed to happen in the first place. Civil rights organizations quickly mobilized, organizing protests outside the courthouse and police headquarters. Signs reading, "Enough is enough," and "Protect our judges, hold them accountable," dotted the crowds. Some protesters even chanted the judge's title, turning it into a rallying cry, "Respect the robe." Amid all the noise, the judge himself remained calm but resolute. Early that morning, he issued a brief statement through his assistant, thanking the community for their support and urging everyone to channel their anger into meaningful action. "This isn't about me," he said simply. "It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I went through last night." His words resonated deeply, striking a chord with those who admired his grace under pressure. But behind closed doors, the judge knew this fight wouldn't be easy. He spent hours consulting with legal advisors, strategizing how best to address the situation. While some urged him to pursue criminal charges against Officer Carter immediately, others cautioned patience, warning that rushing could backfire. After careful consideration, the judge decided to file a formal complaint. not just against Carter, but also against the broader issues within the police department. He wanted answers, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. As for Officer Carter, his world was unraveling fast. Overnight, he went from being a relatively unknown patrolman to the face of police misconduct. Reporters camped outside his home, eager to get a comment. Friends and family distanced themselves, embarrassed by the association. Even his colleagues at the precinct seemed reluctant to defend him publicly, though privately, some whispered that he'd brought this on himself. The police chief, desperate to contain the fallout, held an emergency press conference early that morning. Standing in front of a bank of microphones, he condemned the incident, calling it unacceptable and promising a full investigation. "We are committed to holding officers accountable when they violate our trust," he declared, though skeptics noted the lack of specifics in his statement. Critics pointed out that similar promises had been made before, yet little ever changed. Would this time be different? In response to mounting pressure, Carter was placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. But that didn't stop the calls for more drastic measures. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters chanting slogans like, "Fire him now," and "No justice, no peace." Their voices echoed through the streets, refusing to let the issue fade away. Meanwhile, petitions demanding criminal charges against Carter gained thousands of signatures within hours. Behind the scenes, tensions ran high. City officials huddled in emergency meetings, debating how to handle the crisis. Some argued that charging Carter would send a powerful message, that no one was above the law, not even law enforcement. Others worried about setting a precedent that could alienate officers and make them hesitant to do their jobs. The mayor, caught in the middle, issued a vague statement pledging to do the right thing without offering concrete details. For Carter, the weight of the situation was crushing. He spent most of the day holed up in his apartment, glued to the news coverage. Every new headline, every angry tweet, felt like another blow to his already fragile ego. At first, he tried to rationalize his actions, convincing himself that he'd been following protocol. But as the reality of the situation sank in, denial gave way to panic. What if he lost his job? Worse still, what if he ended up in jail? His union reps did their best to reassure him, vowing to fight tooth and nail to protect his career. They argued that the viral video didn't tell the whole story, that there was context missing, factors the public couldn't possibly understand. To bolster their case, they dug into Carter's past, highlighting years of service and previous commendations. But even they couldn't deny the damning evidence staring them in the face. The slap itself was indefensible, no matter how hard they tried to spin it. Meanwhile, the community continued to rally around the judge. Neighbors stopped by his house to offer support, leaving flowers and handwritten notes on his doorstep. Strangers sent letters and emails, sharing stories of their own encounters with police brutality and thanking him for standing tall. One elderly woman wrote, "You've given us hope when we needed it most. Please don't give up." Despite the overwhelming show of solidarity, the judge knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth. He understood that fighting for justice meant facing resistance, not just from the police department but from systems designed to protect those in power. Still, he refused to back down. For him, this wasn't just about seeking retribution. It was about creating lasting change. He envisioned a future where no one had to fear being treated unfairly based on the color of their skin or the clothes they wore. As the days passed, the momentum only grew stronger. Protests spread to neighboring cities, drawing attention from national figures and advocacy groups. Lawyers specializing in civil rights cases reached out to the judge, offering their services pro bono. Journalists conducted interviews with residents, amplifying their voices and shedding light on the systemic issues plaguing the community. Slowly but surely, a movement began to take shape, one rooted in resilience, unity, and a shared desire for accountability. And yet, despite the progress, questions lingered. Could true justice ever be achieved in a system so deeply entrenched in bias? Would holding one officer accountable really make a difference? Or was it merely treating a symptom rather than the disease? These were the kinds of conversations happening across dinner tables and town halls, sparking debates that showed no signs of slowing down. For now, all eyes remained fixed on the unfolding drama. Everyone waited anxiously to see what would happen next, to Officer Carter, to the judge, and to the fractured relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served. Whatever the outcome, one thing was certain. The events of that fateful night had ignited something far greater than anyone could have anticipated. As the days turned into a week, the investigation into the incident began to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. What started as a straightforward case of police misconduct quickly spiraled into something far more complex, revealing layers of deception and betrayal that shocked everyone involved. The community, already reeling from the slap heard around the world, found itself grappling with new revelations that painted a darker picture of what had really happened that night. The first bombshell came during the preliminary hearing. A team of investigators assigned to review the case uncovered surveillance footage from earlier in the evening, footage that provided critical context to Officer Carter's actions. It turned out that Carter hadn't randomly targeted the judge while patrolling the neighborhood. Instead, he'd received an anonymous tip hours before the incident, claiming that a man matching the judge's description was involved in illegal activities. According to the caller, this individual posed a threat and needed to be stopped immediately. At first glance, the tip seemed credible enough for Carter to act on it. After all, officers often rely on such information to prevent crimes or catch suspects. But as the investigators dug deeper, they discovered something alarming. The tip was completely fabricated. There was no evidence tying the judge to any wrongdoing whatsoever. In fact, the call appeared to have been made by someone with a personal vendetta against him, a disgruntled former defense attorney who had clashed with the judge in court years earlier. This revelation sent shockwaves through the city, raising questions about how easily misinformation could lead to disastrous consequences. For Officer Carter, the discovery added a layer of complexity to his already precarious situation. On one hand, it suggested that he might not have acted entirely out of malice. He may have genuinely believed he was pursuing a legitimate lead. But on the other hand, the fact that he resorted to violence without verifying the tip exposed glaring flaws in his judgment and in the training he'd received as a police officer. Critics argued that relying solely on an unverified tip, especially one targeting a black man, reflected deeply ingrained biases within law enforcement. To them, Carter's actions were symptomatic of a much larger problem. Public opinion began to fracture as details emerged. Some people sympathized with Carter, viewing him as a pawn in a bigger game orchestrated by someone with ulterior motives. They pointed to the anonymous tip as proof that he wasn't entirely at fault and called for leniency. Others dismissed these arguments, insisting that Carter should have known better than to escalate the situation so recklessly. Even if he thought it was true, one protester shouted during a rally, "You don't slap anyone, let alone a judge." Amid the heated debates, the judge remained steadfast in his mission to seek accountability, not just for himself but for the broader community. He understood that while Carter bore responsibility for his actions, the issue ran deeper than one bad decision. During a press conference held at the courthouse, flanked by civil rights leaders and legal experts, the judge addressed the public directly. His words were measured yet powerful, cutting through the noise and focusing on solutions rather than blame. "This is not about revenge," he said, looking straight into the cameras. "It's about reform. We cannot allow fear, bias, or misinformation to dictate how we treat each other. If we want change, we must hold ourselves accountable at every level." His message resonated deeply, striking a chord with those who saw this moment as an opportunity to push for systemic improvements. Activists seized the momentum, organizing workshops and town halls to discuss potential reforms. Topics ranged from implementing better vetting processes for anonymous tips to requiring mandatory de-escalation training for officers. Lawmakers, sensing the growing demand for action, introduced bills aimed at increasing transparency and oversight within the police department. For once, it felt like real progress was within reach. But behind the scenes, resistance brewed. Powerful figures within the police union fought back against calls for sweeping changes, arguing that too many restrictions would hinder their ability to do their jobs effectively. They framed the incident as an isolated event, downplaying its significance and urging the public to move on. Their efforts sparked heated exchanges on social media, where supporters of reform accused them of protecting a broken system. Tensions reached a boiling point when a group of officers staged a walkout during a city council meeting, protesting proposed policy changes. Despite the backlash, the judge refused to back down. He met privately with city officials, urging them to prioritize long-term solutions over short-term fixes. "This isn't just about me," he reminded them. "It's about ensuring that future generations don't have to face the same struggles we're dealing with today." His persistence paid off when the mayor announced plans to form a task force dedicated to addressing systemic issues within law enforcement. Comprised of community leaders, activists, and independent experts, the task force promised to deliver recommendations within 6 months. Meanwhile, Carter's fate hung precariously in the balance. With mounting evidence against him, including witness testimonies corroborating the judge's account, prosecutors faced immense pressure to file criminal charges. Yet they also grappled with concerns about setting a precedent that could alienate officers and complicate relations between law enforcement and the public. The district attorney ultimately decided to charge Carter with misdemeanor assault, citing the need to balance accountability with fairness. While some hailed the decision as a step in the right direction, others criticized it as being too lenient, given the severity of the offense. Carter, meanwhile, struggled to come to terms with the fallout. Stripped of his badge and placed on indefinite leave, he became a pariah both inside and outside the department. Former colleagues avoided him, fearing guilt by association. Friends stopped answering his calls. Even his family grew distant, unable to reconcile the man they knew with the image plastered across newspapers and TV screens. Isolated and ashamed, Carter retreated further into himself, spending most of his time watching news coverage of the case and reading angry comments online. Yet, even as he faced professional ruin, Carter clung to denial. In interviews with investigators, he continued to insist that he'd acted appropriately under the circumstances. "I was doing my job," he told them repeatedly, though his voice lacked conviction. When pressed about the slap specifically, he claimed it was a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by stress, a justification that did little to sway public opinion. By the end of the week, the story had taken on a life of its own. Protesters marched daily, demanding justice not only for the judge but for countless others who had suffered similar injustices without recognition. Artists created murals honoring the judge's courage, turning blank walls into symbols of hope and resilience. Musicians wrote songs inspired by the incident, their lyrics echoing the frustrations and aspirations of a community yearning for change. Through it all, the judge remained a steady presence, using his platform to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. He visited schools, churches, and community centers, engaging in candid conversations about race, power, and accountability. Everywhere he went, people thanked him, not just for standing up to abuse, but for reminding them that dignity and strength could prevail even in the darkest moments. And so, as the investigation pressed on and the trial loomed ahead, the city braced itself for what was sure to be a pivotal chapter in its history. Whatever the outcome, one thing was clear: the events of that fateful night had ignited a movement, one that showed no signs of slowing down anytime soon. As the trial date approached, the city buzzed with anticipation. The courtroom became the epicenter of attention, drawing reporters, activists, and curious citizens eager to witness history unfold. Seats filled up quickly each day, and those who couldn't make it inside gathered outside, holding signs and chanting slogans in solidarity. For many, this wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a referendum on justice itself. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense but orderly. The judge sat quietly in the front row, flanked by his attorneys and supporters. His expression remained calm, though anyone paying close attention could see the weight of the moment etched into his features. This wasn't just about one slap. It was about years of systemic inequities finally coming to light. Every word spoken during the trial carried significance, every piece of evidence scrutinized for its potential to tip the scales toward accountability, or away from it. Officer, Carter, dressed in a plain suit rather than his usual uniform, looked visibly uneasy as he took the stand. Under oath, he recounted the events leading up to the incident, sticking to his earlier claims that he believed he was following protocol. When asked about the anonymous tip, he admitted that he hadn't verified its accuracy before confronting the judge. "I trusted the information I received," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "I thought I was doing what needed to be done." But when pressed further about why he felt compelled to use physical force despite the judge's cooperation, Carter struggled to provide a satisfactory answer. He fumbled through explanations, at times contradicting himself until even his own defense team seemed exasperated. Watching him squirm under cross-examination, some in the gallery exchanged knowing glances. It was clear that no amount of justification could erase the image of him slapping an unarmed man across the face. The prosecution presented a compelling case, weaving together surveillance footage, witness testimonies, and expert analysis to paint a damning picture of Carter's actions. One key witness, a retired police captain turned whistleblower, testified that Carter's behavior represented everything wrong with modern policing: overaggression, lack of accountability, and implicit bias. "You don't become a cop to dominate people," he told the court. "You do it to protect and serve. What happened here is the exact opposite of that." For the judge, listening to the proceedings was both painful and empowering. Painful, because reliving the incident brought back memories he'd rather forget. Empowering, because he saw firsthand how his decision to speak out had galvanized others to demand change. During breaks in the trial, he often stepped outside to greet supporters, thanking them for their unwavering dedication. "This isn't my fight alone," he reminded them repeatedly. "It's ours." As the days dragged on, public interest in the trial only intensified. Social media played a pivotal role, with hashtags like accountability matters trending globally. People shared memes, infographics, and personal stories, creating a digital tapestry of voices united by a common goal: justice. Even celebrities weighed in, using their platforms to amplify the message. One actor tweeted, "If we can't trust the law to treat everyone fairly, then what's the point of having laws at all?" Outside the courthouse, protests continued unabated. Marchers carried banners bearing slogans like "No bad cops" and "Justice without fear." Some held portraits of victims of police brutality, reminding everyone present that this fight stretched far beyond one individual or one incident. At night, candlelight vigils transformed streets into solemn memorials, where strangers came together to mourn losses and celebrate resilience. Amid the chaos, there were moments of grace. A local artist painted a mural depicting the judge standing, tall against a backdrop of raised fists and blooming flowers, a symbol of hope amid adversity. Restaurants donated meals to protesters, while musicians performed impromptu concerts to keep spirits high. These small acts of kindness served as reminders that even in the darkest times, humanity has a way of shining through. Back in the courtroom, closing arguments marked the final stretch of the trial. The prosecutor delivered a fiery speech, urging the jury to recognize the gravity of what had transpired. "This isn't just about one officer making a mistake," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "It's about sending a message that no one, not even those sworn to uphold, the law is above it." She paused, scanning the room before adding, "Let this verdict be the start of something better." Carter's defense attorney countered with a plea for leniency, arguing that his client had been misled by faulty information and deserved another chance. "We're all human," he said. "We all make mistakes. Let's not throw away someone's life over a single moment of poor judgment." While some nodded in agreement, others rolled their eyes, unconvinced by the argument. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of misdemeanor assault. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the foreperson read the decision aloud. Carter hung his head, defeated, while the judge allowed himself a faint smile, a quiet acknowledgement of the hard-fought victory. Outside, cheers erupted as news of the verdict spread. Strangers hugged, tears streaming down their faces as they celebrated a rare win for accountability. But the celebration was short-lived. Though Carter faced 6 months in jail and mandatory sensitivity training, critics argued that the punishment didn't fit the crime. Protesters chanted, "6 months, that's it," while others vowed to keep pushing for harsher penalties in future cases. For the judge, the verdict was bittersweet. Yes, justice had been served, but only partially. True reform, he knew, would require much more than convicting one officer. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the trial became undeniable. The police chief resigned amid mounting pressure, paving the way for new leadership committed to transparency and accountability. Sweeping reforms were implemented, including stricter guidelines for handling anonymous tips, increased community oversight, and mandatory de-escalation training for all officers. Activists hailed these changes as steps in the right direction, though they cautioned against complacency. For Carter, life after the trial was unrecognizable. Ostracized by colleagues and unable to find work in law enforcement, he struggled to rebuild his life. Rumors swirled that he'd moved out of state, seeking anonymity in a small town where no one knew his name. Meanwhile, the judge returned to his duties on the bench, using his experiences to advocate for fairness and equality in every case he presided over. As time passed, the story faded from headlines, replaced by newer scandals and crises. But its impact lingered, shaping conversations about race, power, and justice for years to come. For the community, it served as a reminder that standing up to abuse, even when it feels impossible, can spark meaningful change. And for the judge, it reinforced his belief in the enduring power of courage, dignity, and hope. The verdict may have marked the end of the trial, but it was only the beginning of a much larger journey. For the judge, life didn't return to normal after the courtroom drama subsided. If anything, his role in the community grew even more significant. People looked to him not just as a symbol of justice, but as a beacon of hope, a living reminder that standing up against wrongdoing could lead to real change. He embraced this responsibility with humility, knowing that his actions had sparked something bigger than himself. In the months following the trial, the judge became a central figure in efforts to reform law enforcement practices. Community leaders, activists, and even some open-minded officers sought his guidance as they worked to rebuild trust between the police department and the neighborhoods it served. Town hall meetings were held regularly, where residents voiced their concerns directly to officials. At one such meeting, a young woman stood up and said, "I'm scared every time I see a cop car. I don't want my son growing up feeling the same way." Her words resonated deeply, prompting promises from the new police chief to prioritize transparency and accountability. The reforms weren't perfect, and progress came slowly. Some changes, like body cameras for all officers and stricter rules for using force, were implemented quickly. Others, like creating civilian oversight boards and rethinking how officers are trained, took longer to materialize. But the judge remained patient, understanding that meaningful transformation required time and effort. He often reminded people, change doesn't happen overnight. It's a marathon, not a sprint. For Officer Carter, life took a drastically different turn. Once a respected member of the force, he now found himself isolated and struggling to adapt to his new reality. After serving 6 months in jail, he emerged a changed man, or so it seemed. Friends who reached out during his incarceration noticed a shift in his demeanor. Gone was the brash confidence. In its place was a quiet resignation. "I messed up," he admitted to one old colleague over coffee. "And I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life." But redemption wasn't easy to come by. Finding work proved nearly impossible, as no employer wanted to hire someone with his reputation. Eventually, Carter moved out of the city, settling in a small town where he hoped to start fresh. There, he took on odd jobs, working at a gas station, mowing lawns, anything to make ends meet. Rumors circulated that he volunteered at a local shelter, though he rarely spoke about it publicly. Whether this was an attempt to redeem himself or simply a way to stay busy, no one could say for sure. Back in the city, the scars left by the incident lingered, though they began to heal with time. Murals dedicated to the judge still adorned walls, their vibrant colors fading slightly under the sun but retaining their power to inspire. Schools incorporated discussions about systemic racism and police accountability into their curriculums, ensuring that future generations would learn from the mistakes of the past. Even late-night talk show hosts joked about the slap, turning what had once been a moment of outrage into a cultural touchstone. Yet despite these positive developments, challenges remained. Not everyone supported the reforms, and tensions occasionally flared when incidents of misconduct resurfaced. Skeptics argued that the changes were superficial, designed to appease critics rather than address deeper issues. During one heated debate on a radio show, a caller bluntly stated, "You can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig." His comment sparked outrage, but it also highlighted the lingering mistrust many felt toward law enforcement. Through it all, the judge continued to push forward, determined to leave a lasting legacy. He partnered with advocacy groups to create programs aimed at bridging gaps between communities and police departments. One initiative paired officers with local youth, giving them opportunities to interact outside of tense situations. Another provided free legal clinics for residents seeking help navigating the justice system. These efforts, while modest, helped foster dialogue and understanding, small steps toward a brighter future. On a personal level, the judge found solace in moments of reflection. Late at night, after a long day at the courthouse, he'd sit on his porch sipping tea and watching the stars. Sometimes neighbors would join him, sharing stories or simply enjoying the quiet companionship. On one such evening, a young boy approached him shyly, clutching a drawing in his hand. "This is for you," the child said, handing over the picture. It depicted the judge standing tall, surrounded by smiling faces and colorful flowers. Moved by the gesture, the judge thanked the boy and promised to hang the artwork proudly in his office. As years passed, the memory of that fateful night never fully faded. It lived on in books, documentaries, and speeches, serving as both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. Scholars studied the case, analyzing how one event could galvanize an entire movement. Journalists revisited the story periodically, checking in on the key players and assessing the impact of the reforms. And ordinary citizens continued to share their thoughts online, debating whether true justice had been achieved or if there was still work to be done. For the judge, the answer was clear. The fight was far from over. While strides had been made, he knew that dismantling centuries-old systems of oppression required relentless effort. He often quoted a line he'd heard during one of his speeches: "Justice isn't a destination, it's a direction." To him, those words encapsulated everything he believed in. Progress might be slow, uneven, and sometimes painful, but as long as people kept moving forward, there was reason to hope. Looking back, the judge couldn't help but marvel at how one moment had changed so much, not just for him, but for countless others. That single slap, born out of prejudice and ignorance, had ignited a firestorm of activism, accountability, and reform. It had exposed deep-seated flaws in society, while also revealing the resilience and determination of those committed to fixing them. And yet the judge refused to let himself become complacent. He knew better than anyone that victories, no matter how hard won, were fragile. They needed constant nurturing, protection, and reinforcement. So he kept showing up, day after day, year after year, ready to listen, to teach, and to lead. Because in the end, it wasn't about titles or accolades. It was about doing what was right, even when it was hard. As he walked through the streets of his neighborhood one crisp autumn morning, the judge felt a sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead was uncertain, full of obstacles and unknowns. But for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that things could and would get better. After all, if one slap could shake the foundations of injustice, imagine what an entire movement could achieve.